discover a world of magic and steam technology. An alternate London where mythical creatures coexist with humans.
Hey everybody, I'm Daniel with Game Banshee. I'm here today with Isaac from Crimson Herring Studios, and we're going to talk about Sovereign Syndicate. So to start out with, in case someone who's watching doesn't know about the game, what's up with the game?
Sure. So Sovereign Syndicate is a Victorian steampunk RPG that uses tarot cards instead of dice. 3 playable characters with an intertwined story that takes place in London's East Docklands.
I want to start actually by talking about the 3 playable characters. So who are they?
Sure. So we're really inspired by how, in Arcanum, how reactive the NPCs in the world were to who you were as a character, right? To your gender, to your race, to your class, to how you were dressed. And so we wanted to tell a really good story, a really tailored story. So we decided to create 3 characters ourselves instead of allowing the player to create their own character. We will make sure we really tailored that narrative to who, the reactions of the NPCs to who the player was as a character. So choosing 3 very different characters, right? Atticus Daly, an alcoholic minotaur who's a bit down on his luck. Clara Reed, who is a courtesan and a corsair, so she's a bit of a thief, a bit of a rapscallion. Obviously, as a woman in the Victorian era, there'd be a lot of restrictions on her life, who she could interact with, the places that she could go, the restrictions that are put on things like how she's supposed to dress, how she's supposed to behave. And then Teddy Redgrave, who is a dwarf engineer, and his companion, which is an automaton named Otto. So struggling with the emergence of sentience of automatons, how automatons would be viewed in a world, much like automation is today. Right? How do we view automation, things like AI and ChatGPT, and the concern that people have about it stealing their jobs and that sort of stuff. Looking at Luddites in the Victorian community and how they would really feel like technology is taking over, right? A lot of the same social issues that we deal with. So trying to explore the story from 3 very different perspectives to be able to tell, we think, a very holistic story through those 3 different lenses.
Very cool. And so you said the story is intertwined, so do you pick one character at the start of the game, or do you switch between them?
No, we choose for you. So you start as Atticus, and we sort of divide the story into what we call chapters, and so you every once in a while you switch characters at predefined points. But the decisions that you make as each character as you progress affect how the story goes for really all the characters involved. So you'll play one campaign, but you'll play as all 3 characters.
Very cool. And so is it the case that I assume, since it's always the playable character, you can't run into yourself?
Well,
or can you?
Yeah, we do, right? They do coexist in the same area. They have, very different concerns, different motivations, different reasons that they're there. But yes, sometimes their stories will overlap.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Is the way that you interact with them, like you said that, a decision that you make as one character can change what happens as another character. So is the character, when you encounter one of the other playable characters as a specific one, does that interaction change based on how you've been behaving as that? Wow, that is fantastic.
Yeah.
So, now you're getting me more excited to play it.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little about the sort of the games that have influenced?
Sure. So, in the CRPG genre, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Like we're from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So obviously BioWare comes from there. So we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about BioWare, right? Baldur's Gate being a big influence. But also games like Shadowrun, Disco Elysium, and Arcanum, right? So Disco Elysium, obviously we're a dialogue-heavy narrative RPG, right? We use the dialogue on the right-hand side like Shadowrun and Disco Elysium did. We have the internal voices like Disco Elysium. Of course, we've associated with them with phrenology and the humors and stuff like that. So we think it's a bit of a twist on it, but it's definitely inspired by Disco Elysium. Shadowrun has the 5 different types of metahumans. We have our own 5 types. They're different. And Arcanum, of course, being the cult classic steampunk RPG, we were really impressed by how reactive the NPCs were to your gender, your race, your class, how you were dressed. So we've really tried to work those things into our game as well.
Very cool. So I wanted to ask about the races in the game, because you had mentioned dwarves, which are sort of an expected RPG standard, but then minotaurs are not. Yeah. I know that there's also Cyclops in the game. Yeah. And I noticed that there was a lot of references to Greek mythology in the demo that I played. So Can you talk a little bit about the decision to do that and like what other kinds of creatures we can expect in the game?
Sure. So we were really inspired by Shadowrun and its different species of metahumans. But we want to take it in a bit of a different direction, right? A lot of fantasy right now is focused on the more traditional orcs and trolls and halflings and elves and things like that. And so we thought, what if we created a world without those things, right? Where could we lean in order to do that? And so leaning into Greek mythology, we look at, right, minotaurs, cyclopes, centaurs. I always wanted centaurs in an RPG. So that's been really cool to do that.
Yeah. Awesome. And so I'm curious, is there, well, for example, I know you spoke earlier about how one of your big influences is Disco Elysium.
Mm-hmm.
And not on camera, don't get confused. So obviously one of the influences of the game is Disco Elysium. You know, that game, they sort of have their own lore, but they also reference historical things that are sort of, communism and those things. So I'm curious if like there's a reason, or an in-game reason, that the Greek myths or the Greek characters are part of the story.
Yeah. So I don't want to spoil that too much, but you're on the right track, right? We think that there's a lot to be said for using Earth and sort of an alternate history version of Earth, but there's so much world building that you don't have to do, that players can make assumptions about when you're not creating your whole own world, but you're using Earth. Right, it's in London. It's in a Victorian era. There just happens to be Greek mythological creatures there. So of course the world's evolved differently. It's steampunk instead of where we are today. It's a different era, different races and creatures and things like that. We think that's going to be really fun, but it also keeps us from having to do too much world building because the player can make a lot of assumptions about things that we already know about our own world.
Right. How different would you say the world of Sovereign Syndicate is? I noticed that in the demo there's a lot of hoverable text, tin for money, and some of them are intuitive, but some of them aren't. So I guess I know it's kind of a nebulous question, but how confused would someone from Victorian England be if they were dropped into Sovereign Syndicate?
Yeah, so we try to do a lot of historical research into the language and cadence of the time, a lot of the slang and things like that. So obviously we want to give a glossary to the player so that they understand those words. It's a narrative-driven game, so we want it to be very legible, right? People understand it. We didn't want the lore to be too dense, but we did want to write it in a very historically accurate way. So there is a lot of, Victorian England English in the game.
Oh, interesting. So those are things that maybe, as someone, I'm unfamiliar with Victorian England as far as history goes, and so I think there was things I thought were maybe lore translations, but it was just period accurate slang. Right?
Yeah, right. Like we tried to use real writings from the time, really inspired by Victorian era science fiction, right? Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and Mary Shelley and Charles Dickens and all that sort of stuff. But we also used real historical references, Charles Booth's poverty journal or police journals and poverty maps. Just write any real historical references that we could that had real depictions of language and the conditions of the era, right? We also deal with a lot of mature themes, right? We didn't want to create a Victorian era steampunk game and not deal with some of the realities of living in Victorian England. So dealing with substance abuse and lack of regulations around medicines and things like that we sort of take for granted today, right? Classism, racism, wealth disparity, right? A lot of things we deal with today, but we're definitely very different in the Victorian era, and we didn't want to just gloss over those things and ignore them.
Absolutely. So you mentioned some period sci-fi. People who've read H.G. Wells or Shelley, can they expect any things from those books to have come to life or to be real in Sovereign Syndicate?
Sure. So what I always liked about Jules Verne is that his science fiction was very scientific. It was very foundational and rooted in real science. So you could understand how those things could actually come to be given sufficient research and technology and materials and things like that. And so we try and make our science fiction really grounded. Things that exist in our world could have existed had we taken those different steps.
Right. Very cool. I'm going to have to read some H.G. Wells now so I can get all the references. We touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious if you could talk more about the tarot cards, how the system works, and sort of even just the design decision or how you decided to get to that point where you use the cards.
Sure. So we're leaning into Victorian mysticism and sort of the pseudoscience of the era. So we use things like phrenology to determine the skills map and the different skills and player voices and things like that. And we just thought the tarot cards was a little bit of a more mystical choice and gave us a bit more of a dynamic difficulty than dice, right? I think dice is very common, dice works very well, but we thought that we could get more strategic and more depth out of a card system. So using tarot cards we thought was very period specific, very suitable, but also gives us that strategic and dynamic difficulty of, as you draw cards out of the deck, your difficulty changes because you no longer have those cards available until your deck gets reshuffled. And then working in the deck building elements of the contrast between the major and minor arcana, using the minor arcana more like dice, and using the major arcana as a deck building system, where as your character progresses and levels up, you can unlock new cards that change the way that game is played.
Interesting. And so you can sort of use your tarot cards to lean into an archetype that you're building.
Exactly.
Or I guess could it also be used to cover weaknesses?
Yes.
Things that you feel like you want to be able to do sometimes, but your character's not spec for?
Yeah, exactly, right? We expect people to use it in a way to have the story unfold in a way that they would like, or at least give them a better opportunity to do that. And we expect people to do things like card counting and going, okay, right, I just used up a bunch of my really good cards in that deck. So either I need to go find skill checks that use my other decks that aren't completed yet, or I need to wait until that deck gets reshuffled before I go and do this really important check.
Right. So you're like actually encouraging players to sort of play with the system and intentionally maybe go and do a check somewhere so that you can force a shuffle of a deck that you want to use on a challenging thing.
Yep.
How do retries work? If you fail a task, is there just a consequence and then you move on, or can you go back and try things later?
Yeah, there's going to be a mixture of that. We didn't really want failure to be permanent, right? Or if it is permanent, we wanted it to not stop you from proceeding in the story, right? We all succeed and fail in everything we do every day. Doesn't mean that our life stops unless we make a really serious decision that is a real serious failure, right? But life goes on, right? You can make a mistake. You learn something from your mistakes. We wanted that too, right? Even if you fail a skill check, you gain experience. Because even if we fail, we learn something about what we did and we get better at it. So that's what we were guided by.
So something else I noticed in the game that sort of goes back to the influence of the Greek mythology and culture is there's humors in the game. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so we needed a experience mechanism. So we talked a little bit about the phrenology and how every region of your brain is a skill. And as you use those voices, as you choose those dialogue options, you're feeding that part of your personality. You're feeding that part of your brain. You're strengthening it. And so we use the concept of the balance of the four humors to associate them with those brain parts. And so your humors are increasing in that area. So you can get more and more out of balance. Personality can get shifted, and you can start to get dominated by those voices that you're feeding more often. So that part of your mind getting stronger, your personality gets more shifted towards those voices, your humors get out of balance. It can really change your personality.
Oh, interesting. So I can see how it would sort of drown out the other voices. You're not hearing from witch, you're only hearing from animal instinct. But can it also affect your ability to make decisions? Like if you go too far down the tree, you won't have any choice but to follow your animal instincts, for example?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Very interesting. So I know sometimes games shift or change a lot. You have to make allowances for, I didn't realize that the tech can do this or that. Were there any major changes that happened in development?
We're definitely questioning. I mean, right, we're an indie studio. We have limited budget. And so we think about things like localization and voiceover, for example, right? Localization, right? We're targeting about 500,000 words. So you got to think that every localization we do is about $60,000. So, right, if we want to do all the languages we want to do, it's going to be quite expensive. Same with voiceover, right? You want an actor to voice over 500,000 words, or multiple actors, of course. That's expensive. So as much as we'd like to do some of those things, it's going to come down to what we can afford. Yeah.
Is there any possibility that, sort of like Disco Elysium, that, everyone plays your awesome game and it sells well, and then you might consider going back and adding stuff like that you wanted to do initially? Yeah, exactly.
Those are good problems to have, right? If we definitely want to keep developing the game, updating the game, make it the best product that we can. So absolutely, if it does really well, I'm happy to go back and add more features if the community wants it.
Awesome. And also, I'd love to, and I'm just curious, can you tell us a little about Crimson Heron? This is your first game, right?
Sure, yeah. So first game, first studio. So April of 2020, I started the studio, middle of COVID lockdown. I was working from home, stuck at home like all of us were. And I was really seeking a creative outlet and maybe a healthy distraction, right? And so I decided, I was playing a lot of video games, right? Playing a lot of Disco Elysium, playing a lot of Arcanum, Shadowrun, all that stuff. I just thought, I really wish there were more games like this. So part of the problem or part of the solution, right? I decided to be a part of the solution and start my own company and fund a studio. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, where the legacy of BioWare is there, and there's a lot of really talented people. And unfortunately, because of COVID, a lot of really talented people who are out of work. And so I thought, I had some money put away. I'd always wanted to start a small business. Lots of talented people available who can do the work. I have a passionate project that I want to make, so let's do it. So, over the last 3 years, we've just been growing the studio, attracting funding, making what we think is a great game. And we're about a year from release, and now we're here at PAX. So it's been a wild ride, I tell you.
Awesome. What a great way to use the time spent at home, huh?
Yeah.
Cool. So if people want to check out Sovereign Syndicate, what should they do?
Well, it's on Steam right now. There's a demo available on Steam. Of course, we are showing here at PAX East too. So if you're in Boston right now, come and see us. But it's on Steam as well. We've got a demo up there, and they can download the demo, play it anytime.
Very cool. And when can we expect the game to come out?
It's about a year away. So this time next year, probably first quarter.
You're going to have to be patient, people.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for talking with us, Isaac. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.